My name's Arthur Wensinger, a retired professor at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. In 2005, my colleague Alan Wilkinson and I put together a tentative 2-hour version of a DVD dealing with my experiences in Munich in the year 1948. On the basis of photographs that I had taken in Germany at that time, long ago, we put together a sort of personal history travelogue. This was eventually enhanced by contrasting those 1948 Munich images with a series of photographs of the same places revisited with my friend and German partner Heribert Wenck. That was a couple of years ago. This longer DVD version, which is not confined to Munich, concludes with personal and historical speculations. We called the product of those efforts Out of the Mothballs. However, it is far too long for our purposes today, and it hasn't yet been edited down into a final version, but it can be seen by anybody who would like to borrow a copy. For today's purposes, we have reduced its length by more than half, concentrating specifically on our group's activities in the area of the University of Munich and at the Antonie-Haus, a student dormitory in the Kaulbachstrasse, very close to the university. I had gone to Munich relatively soon after the end of World War II with a group of other young men, not even quite half a dozen, most of us fresh out of college, a couple of us undergraduates still. The program was part of the revitalized Experiment in International Living of Putney, Vermont, a Quaker-inspired educational organization. We constituted the first post-war group of United States civilians permitted to work and live together with an equal number of young German partners in the American zone of occupation in southern Bavaria. That permission contained the proviso that we earn our privilege and keep by helping in the reconstruction of one of the partially destroyed buildings near the devastated university. All of that is spelled out in the longer version of this presentation. The site of our work was the Marie Antonia Women's Dormitory, whose 100th anniversary is being celebrated. As it happens, 2008 is also the 60th anniversary of our work there at the dormitory. 60 years ago, I knew nothing at all about the history of the original dormitory or about its reconfiguration and expansion in the early 1930s. If we were told about it, I have long since forgotten. Nor was I in the slightest curious about the source of the new name given to it then in the early 30s. To us, it was just a half-bombed-out shell of a building. Only now am I learning something about the man behind it and behind so much else in Munich and in other places in Bavaria during the first third of the 20th century. That is the expatriate American philanthropist, social and cultural innovator, and collector, the wonderfully productive aesthete scholar James Loeb. I hope to learn more about him and his wife, Marie Antonia, during the course of this anniversary celebration. The little that I've been able to read thus far about Loeb and his multifarious benefactions impresses me enormously. The central impulse behind this celebration, as I understand it, is to acknowledge the generosity and to revivify the memory of this quite remarkable man. From our immediate perspective, one of the more modest motivations for this celebration is also to look back at the history, the post-war fate, and the present-day role of the Marie Antonie-Haus, in whose rebirth we American students played a small part 6 decades ago. It had been in Dartmouth Hall in the fall of 1947 that we were visited by one Donald Watt, founder of the Experiment in International Living of Putney, Vermont. Still going. He was recruiting college students to join up for the first groups to go to Germany after World War II. The mission I signed up for was to help rebuild a bombed-out women's dormitory at the University of Munich. A second smaller group was going to go to Stuttgart. In the Munich group, we were about a dozen boys. Not quite, I think. So the idea of such a venture was irresistible. How did we young Americans who had not served in the military in Europe, all but one of whom had never been abroad, who had never seen firsthand the near obliteration of a country, how did we 19 to 22-year-olds absorb what we saw? I can't speak for the others. For me, it was mostly sheer adventure, and I don't apologize. The war had ended barely 3 years earlier, but from what we saw, it seemed more as if it had only been 1 or less. We got to Munich, stood there, looked around, and saw a city, and later much of the rest of the country, in astonishing ruin. We met our German partners, began working with them, and not one of them or anyone else we met, with a few notable exceptions, seemed willing to talk in tangible terms about what they'd been through. When our little group arrived in Munich, it was the evening of a day at the beginning of June 1948. We emerged from the train from Geneva via Zurich into the dank ruins of what had been Munich's central station, most of its roof and walls still missing. Repairs were being made 24 hours a day. We walked through the streets where an occasional ancient trolley car threaded its way. The streets themselves, after 2.5 years, were fairly well cleared. They were lined on either side by vast piles of rubble, slowly being sorted out and carted away to even vaster mountains of reusable stones and bricks and structural metal. It was an astonishing sight. We wondered, what are these muffled figures doing? Why are they bothering these determined and fastidious Germans? In any case, we began working in earnest on the Maria Antonie-Haus on the Kaulbachstrasse, very near the university, that is to say, very near the ruins of the university. There is a snapshot taken from the top of the still-standing wall of that dormitory, with a view into the interior of what happened to countless buildings in Munich after the incendiary bombs burned out their guts. How odd it seemed that the chimneys still stood. Many did come through the war, but some of these were the first things to be rebuilt. And why? Because people were living in what remained of the ground floors, or more likely in the cellars, and they had to keep warm in the fierce winters following the war. Here's part of our gang. The piles of bricks in the foreground are not our handiwork. We didn't make them. We collected and we scraped them for reuse. Several of the people there are professional masons. The man in the foreground is Professor Wolfgang Müller, an Egyptologist. Indeed, he was one of the most renowned Egyptologists. But of course, here he is doing his bit. Everyone was. This mess had to be dealt with. Hermann dismantles an unsafe wall. That is Hermann's ubiquitous hat on his head. And he seems also to have saved his sunglasses through the war. Across the Kaulbachstrasse, the houses have been partially reconstructed. Some co-workers are taking a break from the job. We have Bill from New Jersey. He became a very close friend of mine, remained one until the end of his life. Next to him is Hans from Augsburg. Until his retirement, Hans was a member of the Directorate, that is the Aluminum Company of Germany. And there is Georg Seebauer, his father. Heinz Münzinger, who was before the war an exchange student in the U.S., was the German liaison for our group. The Münzinger sports store in the Munich Rathaus, the city hall, still thrives as the premier sports emporium of Bavaria. Justin, one of our group, then Hermann, as one can tell by his hat, we called it der verdammte Hut, and Hans. They're taking a rest from dismantling another of the perilous dormitory walls. One by one, the bricks were slid down the chute on the right, and as the bricks landed below and were scraped clean, we passed them along. From me in the beret to Gustl Weber, administrator of the Hill School and leader of the American group, passed on to Bill, then to Hans, then to Roger. Up the bricks were passed to the masons constructing a new wall. We worked like this for the better part of 2 months, with weekend breaks, to return, if we wished, to our German families. The whole thing was certainly good exercise. The wall goes up. This was our mess hall, so to speak, in the cellar of the dorm. Some sort of festive occasion seems to be going on. Why else do some of us have white shirts and jackets on? Hans enters with his Kartoffelknödel, swimming in a puddle of what is probably the dish made of chopped beef lungs called Räucherl. To this day, I still order it when I'm in Munich. It's really an excellent food. Wirsing, a kind of chopped and creamed curly kale, was another favorite specialty. The menu then was restricted, but mostly healthful and hearty, no longer what it was before the currency reform. I found in my envelope of ephemera a menu from the sweet little restaurant Hopfenperle on the Kaulbachstrasse. It is from November 1948. Nothing on it costs the equivalent of more than 75 cents for full meal. Soup was less than a dime. Far more elegant, but not much more expensive, oddly enough, is the menu from the Spiegelsaal restaurant in what was miraculously not destroyed of the Bayerischer Hof Hotel. This menu was dated, as you see, 10 days later. The fanciest selection on the menu, the Chateaubriand, cost about $2.50. The dollar was king then, and remained so from 1950 through 1954, when I returned to study in Munich. Our pay envelopes, yes, we were employees of a building firm, a few marks a week, is being doled out here by Dr. Müller. Why I am wearing a tie, I don't know. The money wasn't much, but it was the first real German money. The Währungsreform, or currency reform, had been declared in June, while we were there, by the banks and the American occupation authorities, 1 new mark for 10 old ones. This resulted in an exchange rate of 4.25 marks to the dollar, a rate that lasted for years. How were we civilian American students made legitimate in the United States zone of occupation? German bureaucracy, through feast and famine, never sleeps. We had to be documented. Among the scraps I have saved are these: permission to live, permission to work, permission to travel out of town and back, from one zone to the other, permission to get paid in German marks, permission to qualify for rationing coupons, for bread, sugar, meat, fat, soap, tobacco, on and on. Happy hour in the cellar. Hans and Bill on the roof. Here are a few press photos of us celebrities. Note how well the Amis, that's what they call us, the Americans, and the Krauts, the Germans, note how well they get along together. The Munich papers were appropriately fascinated by us. We were probably treated too indulgently. One wonders what was really said about us. We were taken on a press walk through the city. Here are 3 professional shots. This one shows 4 of us studying a Litfaßsäule, a kiosk. Culture has returned to Munich. Theater, films, opera. Here are Hans, myself, Justin, and Heribert kneeling. In the background is the Theatinerkirche, the great Baroque church of the Theatrine monks, whose twin towers were more or less spared, but whose interior repair has only just been completed. Here we sit on one of the partially reconstructed ruins of the pair of fountains on either side of the Ludwigstrasse. The main complex of the university is in the background. Large lecture classes were held in auditoriums without roofs. After the experiment months were over, 3 of us stayed on for several more months and we enrolled at the university. The Theatinerkirche closer up. In the right background are the remains of the Odeon. By 1950, when I returned for a year of graduate study, the building to the right of the church was already the main showroom of the Mercedes-Benz firm. Today, the complex behind it is the center of one of the most splendid and costly shopping areas in Europe. After the experiment summer, we who stayed on were much more on our own, and we had to provide for ourselves. But where do we get the essentials? Chocolate, coffee, soap, toilet paper, cigarettes. We, handful of civilians, presented a bit of a challenge to the occupying American forces in Munich. We found a great deal of help. They gave us PX privileges. The centrally located Army Post Exchange was where everything was all but free. In the PX, a carton of cigarettes cost 60 cents, a box of Hershey bars, about the same, not even $1. This is the PX in the background. And this is the view from its entrance looking out. And there is Prince Elector Maximilian I remounted on his pedestal. And here, seated on his pedestal, is Maximilian, King of Bavaria, before the burnt-out hulk of the Residenz, his Munich palace. What did the rest of Munich's core look like? Remember that this is now 3 years since the cessation of hostilities. They're still mopping up the streets and still clearing the rubble. Here, with little comment, are snapshots made in the summer and fall of 1948 in Munich. The first photo shows one of the many portals of the vast palace of the Maxburg. Nothing of it remains except one of these gateways, now incorporated into a new commercial block of buildings. Downtown business blocks like this one, next to the City Hall, and the Frauenkirche were irrecoverable and had been partly cleared away, mostly by hand. Here are spectators of a cheerful autumn parade. There are plenty of perches available to them. Here is another view of the same event. Note an almost resurrected building in the background. Bikes, cars, and trucks on the move. One can see that progress is about to be made here. From the sign, it reads, "Caution, construction area." Here is a part of the arcades and the royal courtyard, the Hofgarten. At the corner of the Prinzregentenstrasse, near the Haus der Kunst, stand the remains of the one-time Prinzregenten Café, now entirely gone. Scrap metal was recovered, piled up, picked over, and ready for reuse, as are the bricks and building stones. This is a typical Schuttberg, or rubble heap. One of the biggest ones was built in the northern part of the city and eventually became the center for the Munich Olympic Games. The strange onion domes of the twin towers of the Frauenkirche, Munich's vast cathedral. It mostly survived, but the surrounding buildings were less fortunate. The slender neo-Gothic spires of the City Hall sustained relatively little damage, but not the nearby business and residential structures. The apartments in the background were luckier than those in the foreground. In a couple of years after this photo of Neptune's Café, it was back in business, but looking quite different, as we shall later see. The man here is digging out, scraping, piling up bricks and stones for future use. A view along the Prinzregentenstrasse. Women are shopping after the currency reform, when stores were restocked. Munich's tallest building, ambitiously dubbed the Wolkenkratzer, or skyscraper, made it through mostly unscathed. We can already see overhead electric streetcar cables. Trolley lines were quickly reestablished all over town, and they remained the principal public transport until the construction years later of a wonderful subway system. Improvised shelters grew up in the rubble for both stores and homes. This is a view of Die Sonnenstraße. Ironically, that means Sunshine Street. An ambulance, a mother and child on a bike, a small car, and trees in leaf. Every salvageable scrap was recycled. These are the so-called Schuttleute, or rubble people. They were mostly women, some children, and old men. A notable proportion of the younger men were dead, or still in Russian prison camps, or without arms or legs. That's a vivid image I still carry with me. Here's the same street from another angle. A glimpse across the street from the Marie Antonie-Haus where we worked. That, one recalls, was the initial reason for this journey. Two of our friends on a stroll through downtown, Mickey and Heribert. In the 50s, Mickey married, had a child, and died far too young. Bill taught at the University of California at Berkeley and at Hunter in New York. He split his time between Manhattan and Vermont. He retired early and settled finally by strong preference year-round in Vermont, where he died in 2002. Hans is still very much with us, less involved with running the world of aluminum. He's a rabid golfer, father and grandfather of several, and living with his wife in a splendid house near the Rhine on the outskirts of Cologne. Hermann, who is now more than content in Hohenschwangau. Heribert became a husband, father, and a big television director and producer in Mainz. He moved many years ago with his family back to Munich, to which beautiful city it was always his goal to return. What did the Maria Antonia house look like before the war? This is what it looked like before the war. The next one shows what it looked like after a number of bombing raids up and down everywhere. And finally, a remarkable reconstruction. This is what it looks like today. The corner of it, where you go in for the main entrance, had in 1948 this appearance. It says Marie Antonie-Haus. It's a dormitory, and still a dormitory, but it's now a co-ed dormitory, and it has rooms, adequate rooms, for about little under 100 students. There's the same corner with the same inscription, but not in mosaic. Hermann stands above, looking down into the Kaulbachstrasse, and if you see this little niche above the main door with the bullseye window, and go up, and between that is a niche, and that was our point of focus, both that niche, the windows, and particularly this round window. So that was saved. We ate in the basement of the Marie Antonie-Haus. That was refurbished. In fact, people lived down there. There we are, having a meal. And that's what the place looks like now. Not very edifying. It seems to me that it's a bar or something. A little jolly evening with Schifferklavier or an accordion, and one of the students all dressed up in a Bavarian Tracht. And the same place today with a ping pong table. Do you see in this one, this is the wall, the lintel has not been put on it yet, but over Roger's head is the round window. And here is what that window is now. It looks out onto the same round window. That building across the way was just about the only one that was really preserved. A shot across the street from the top shows the chimneys, partly rebuilt. We talked about that before. They had to be for the heat that was needed. This is that building now. To all intents and purposes, one chimney showing now, but there are the ruins in front of the St. Martin's Church on the Isar. Sort of a nondescript, not important church. Very little is known about it, but that will go along very well with our final picture, as you will see. Then, the way it looks today, in a shot closer up, I walked into it. It's very attractive. We move then on up toward the center of the city to see an old photograph of what was known as the Munich skyscraper that now has the Department of Weights and Measures and the Vermessungsamt and a number of things in it. It survived quite remarkably during the war. The next picture is on the Sonnenstrasse, which was very badly bombed near the main station, with a lady on a bicycle there with a child. And the way it looks today, a sweep of modern buildings. Clearly everything was gone. The next one is a view down toward the Tal, where the famous and infamous Hofbräuhaus is. This is a overhead passageway that also quite beautifully survived in the war. You notice in the old picture the American Jeep. In the new one, a little patching up, but an automobile facing in exactly the same direction. To the Frauenkirche. By this time in 1948, the roof, which had been completely burned out, as well as the entire interior of the church, the roof had been replaced. And you look at it and think, oh, well, that got through the war pretty well. It certainly did not. It was a total devastation. The towers stood, and the walls, mostly. The next picture shows it with the roof now with those tiny dormer-like windows in the roof itself. Again, the towers of the Frauenkirche with a crane beginning to lift stuff up for the repair of the, I think in this case, the domes of the two towers. Same place in 2004. Here's a picture of Mickey, my friend Mickey, and Heribert walking along in what we think is, we're not absolutely positive, this is either the Maxburgstrasse or the Landschaftsstrasse, which parallels the northern side of the Frauenkirche. Here's a scene of quite total devastation. To give credit, this first picture I got from the Stadtarchiv, the city archives, were very helpful in searching out some of these places. This is a wall of the so-called Maxburg, the Herzog Maxburg, an immense castle, 16th century, that was so entirely destroyed, that what was left was pulled away. But I got a picture of this, one of the many entrances into the various courtyards in this next picture. And it was really something, trying to find out where exactly this gateway was. You see, it has a very particular kind of engaged column or pilaster, and that I was given very many poor leads on that, but finally Barbara Sebald at the Stadtarchiv came up with this. The next one shows a very similar gateway, but it's actually on the other side of the Moxburg. It was the only thing of this really huge palace that survived the war. And so they built in its place, and part of its place, this really quite vapid, if not ugly, business building. I think there are a lot of law firms in there, but this one tower has survived, and that's from exactly the same building. At the beginning of the Ludwigstrasse, as one gets into the city core, that huge, impressive, sometimes oppressive, straight Ludwigstrasse put down by Klenze under Ludwig I in the early 19th century. At the end of it is a copy here of the Loggia del Lanzi in Florence that I mentioned before. And here it was some sort of gathering. There are lions in there, and they're guarding Bavaria. There is the same place, a little farther back as it is today. Around to one side of it, if you can imagine looking, having just seen this great loggia, is the Residenzstrasse, and there are Justin and Hans walking toward us in the Residenzstrasse, and the same shot today. No question about that. The Theatinerkirche is on the other side of the Feldherrnhalle. That has only very recently been completed in its reconstruction. There it is in 48. The 2004 shot was a bad one. You can't get quite the same thing in because some sort of fair was going on. In the background of the next one, you can see the Theatinerkirche from a different angle, farther up the Ludwigstrasse, and there is the Feldherrnhalle also in the background. With Hans and myself, so I didn't take this picture, no credit. Justin, and kneeling is Heribert. Now, he's the only person we could get for the 2004 shot. There he is kneeling at the very same, or the replaced, no doubt, replaced Litfaßsäule, or kind of kiosk where events in the city are posted. Heribert and Mickey, she's glowering at something, looking up the Ludwigstrasse. Heribert's holding his mappa, or his little briefcase, and he's holding, in the next picture, his modern briefcase. Mickey, alas, isn't there. She's no longer with us. But this gives you the view of, it doesn't quite give you the full view of how imposing that street is, how ominous also. Next is the Max-Joseph-Platz, the statue of Max Joseph on his throne, and behind it the Residenz, or the principal palace of Munich, then and now, entirely and beautifully reconstructed. If we shift just a little bit to the right, there's the same place. We don't see the great statue in the middle, but we see in first the ruins of the Nationaltheater, the opera, and as it looks now, resplendent, a house of very beautiful productions. The next is the Armee Museum, the military museum in Munich, the central dome with two very long wings that were devastated, demolished. They were taken away. The thought was to take the Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche in Berlin as an example and preserve it as an admonitory structure. No more war. Look what war did to a building. But then, of course, no, it was too precious a piece of property. And here we have what it is now. The central core reconstructed, and two glass-topped buildings in which the Neue Staatskanzlei, or the state of Bavaria, the chancellery of that state, is now. Not too beautiful, and it no longer reminds us of war, except that the tomb of the unknown soldier is there. The courtyard of the Residenz has around a couple of edges a great gallery building. This is the end of one of the galleries, and you can see a lot of it was preserved and redone. There are art shops mostly in these galleries. It looks kind of tedious, but it's really marvelous place to walk up and down and admire the wildly expensive objects in the windows. We get back to the Ludwigstrasse here. We're looking, and I think perhaps one can see the Siegestor at the far end, but this is the corner of Ludwigstrasse, the Odeonsplatz, and where the Briennerstrasse turns in. And there are Bill and Heinz Münzinger, the leader of the German contingent, and Gustl Weber, our leader. Have no idea who these people on their bicycles are who are standing exactly at the same place. Go up the Briennerstrasse and stop at the first spot. You come to what was the PX, the American PX. There's Heribert, there's a lad putting his foot on the back of I don't know what kind of a car that is, and somebody peeking out of it. And this is the same spot today. Looks like Heribert is trying to put his foot up on a car that's not there, but that's what it looks like today. You can compare the old automobile with, I think, a fairly fancy Mercedes Cabriolet. Turning 180 degrees around from that spot with your back to the PX, you can see the Wittelsbachplatz. In the background, the Palais Ludwig Ferdinand, and in the foreground, the equestrian statue of the Kurfürst, or the Prince Elector Maximilian I. We were going off in a train somewhere. Look at the train then and look at the station now. A bit of a difference there. The Königsplatz, Ludwig I built that with the Propylaeon directly ahead, and on either side, the Glyptothek on the right, we don't see it at all, the first public museum in Germany, and on the other side, what is now the Staatliche Antikensammlung, glorious classical structures. When I went back the last time, I couldn't take a photograph because it was all hung with black crepe. And we thought, my God, who died? It wasn't anybody who died. It was the entertainer named Sting who had been giving a concert there, so I had to come back later and take a picture of the Propylaeon as it looks now. We go north to the area around the university and to the dormitory where we were working and which was really the principal reason for this whole production. On the Türkenstrasse, I'm pretty sure that's where this picture was taken, a typical burned out ruin. And what's there now? Internet and phone shop. And everything on the doorway is basically in techno-English. That's German now today. Two fountains on either side of the Ludwigstrasse, one in front of the university and one across the way near the Veterinärstrasse. A group of us, in fact the same group, taken along. This is another professional shot. The next one is my shot with the renewed main building of the university in the background. Turning north to the right from that spot, we see the Siegestor, the Victory Arch, as it was in 1948, and as it still is now, basically uncompleted. It is not restored. This is the monument to the war. We've seen that one before. Down to the left of that, to the west, is the enormous Akademie der Bildenden Künste, the Art Academy of the university. As it was, not dreadfully wrecked, not so much as the university itself, and as good a picture as I could take in 2004. The trees and the cars make it impossible to take an adequate shot. So there we are. And here we are right now, matter of fact, at Wesleyan University in the Science Tower where Ellen Wilkinson has her office. It's a March day in 2008. What you've been looking at so far is an abridgment, a short segment and a much longer ramble through half a year of my past. In the full version of this presentation, there are many other aspects that I consider. My American family, none of whom knew any German. My education at a Michigan high school, at a Massachusetts boarding school, at Dartmouth College, and at the University of Michigan. We consider my innocent political observations of post-war Germany and my emotional reactions to it. There is an account of what 5 of us undertook from the end of the experiment summer up to Christmas of 1948, our travels in western and northern Germany, our moving into private lodgings in Munich, enrolling at the University of Munich, and working on one of the first German post-war commercial films. Everything constantly surrounded by ruin. We probably did not savor the irony of our situation at the Antonie-Haus, a small group of young Americans helping to restore a building that our United States Air Force, together with the RAF, had nearly obliterated a few years earlier. Exactly which of the hundreds of air raids on Munich from 1943 to 1945 reduced most of the dormitory to rubble, I do not know. In the full DVD treatment, there is a quick look at post-war German journalism and literature with a perplexed eye on what I found to be, at least initially, a uniform tendency on the part of the populace I met, and those I got to know, of dealing very matter-of-factly with this world of ruin. A cool existential take on the collective fate, an acceptance of what had been known as Stunde Null, the 0 hour. That by 1948 was no longer quite the order of the day. Parallel with the massive cleanup work was the inevitable awakening from a collective nightmare. Sitting up, rubbing the eyes, the gradual realization of a crime that even now can hardly be articulated, let alone encompassed by the mind. We saw it acknowledged by some, rejected by others. The work had to go on, and so it did. Popularized a few years after we were there as the Wirtschaftswunder, it was in fact not a miracle at all. It is what the human animal does in search of sustenance, shelter, and a reason to go on. It's immortalized in Brecht's bitter but realistic line, "Erst kommt das Fressen, dann kommt die Moral." At the end of the full DVD, I speak of what became for me, in the ensuing years, the unforgettable revelation, the resurrection of a country and a people who restored their collective soul, who welcomed, in the majority, a polyglot society, who assumed an international obligation, and who thrived. The country has become an admirable fact. How Germany got to where it is today, after 60-some years, is a huge story, whose wider implication is something a United States citizen at the present historical juncture might seriously contemplate. This brief excursion is too modest to earn a grand climax. Instead, let's end on an entirely unexceptional note. The very last part of that video disc is a walk from the Kaulbachstrasse through the Englischer Garten to the Isar and up along its banks to the Museumsinsel. At a point there, the Steinsdorfstrasse crosses the Zweibrückenstrasse just to the west of the museum near the north end of the island. On the northwest corner of this intersection used to stand a handsome and elaborate mid-19th century building that housed the Café Neptune. Like most of Munich, it was ruined in the war and subsequently totally replaced in the early 60s or the early 70s, at a guess. I have come to see this banal replacement as a metaphor for something I felt when, with the help of the Stadtarchiv, I located and then photographed the site a couple of years ago. I could easily have picked one of hundreds of other similar examples. There's nothing special about it at all. In fact, it is a rather homely structure. It's no faithful replication of some piece of Kulturgut. In its post-war vernacular blandness, however, it is somehow genuine. That is exactly why I chose it as being apt to my present purpose. I saw it as symbolizing, modestly yet vividly, a German commitment, an anti-nationalistic European promise. This building evidently contains apartments, perhaps an office or two. In part of the ground floor is a quite unpretentious Chinese restaurant. It could be just about anywhere. That's my point. The mere fact of the place reassured me about Germany today, and it made me comfortable. I entered the restaurant and I asked the proprietor a man from China, who incidentally spoke excellent German, if he knew anything about the history of this building, about the Café Neptune. Nein, he said, nichts. But he was too busy with his customers and with his waiters to be engaged by my peculiar question. He simply asked me if I wanted a table for one, and I said, yes, please. The lunch was very good, and I noticed at a table over there a group of young people. They're probably students, and it's very likely that one or two of them could have been residents of the Marie Antonie-Haus.
Lerne die Menschen anderer Nationen achten und verstehen. Das ist das Ziel eines beachtenswerten Versuches zur Völkerverständigung, der auch diese 4 Studenten zusammenführte. Links der Amerikaner Jerry, neben ihm der Deutsche Hans, Bill aus USA und rechts Herbert aus Erfurt. Sie leben und wohnen für einige Zeit gemeinsam unter einem Dach und arbeiten zusammen als Werkstudenten. Bereits vor mehr als 15 Jahren hat ein Amerikaner, Donald B. Watt, mit diesem Versuch eines internationalen studentischen Gemeinschaftslebens begonnen. Das Marie-Antonie-Haus in München, im Krieg völlig zerstört, ist damals zu diesem Zweck, Studenten verschiedener Nationalität zusammenzuführen, errichtet worden. Die Studenten selbst bauen es nun wieder auf. Eine Gelegenheit für Jerry und Bill aus USA, das gemeinsame Werk auch gemeinsam wiederherzustellen. Und sie sehen und erleben so, unter welchen Bedingungen deutsche Werkstudenten heute arbeiten und studieren. Das Einzige, was von dem Haus der Völkerverständigung nach dem Kriege übrig geblieben war, ist die Ehrentafel seiner Spender. Grundstück, Haus und Möbel, alles wurde einstmals von amerikanischen und deutschen Staatsbürgern gestiftet. Heute existiert das Marie-Antonie-Haus nur durch die Unterstützung des Studentenwerkes, einer Organisation der studentischen Selbsthilfe. Hier wohnt die Jugend voller Ideale aus 2 Nationen. Geselligkeit zwischen Studium und Geldverdienen überbrückt auch schwere Stunden. Hinter diesen Türen, die die Namen der einstigen Spender tragen, leben sie zusammen in internationaler Wohngemeinschaft. und sie verstehen sich ausgezeichnet. Bill betrachtet die Bibliothek seines deutschen Freundes Hans. Dr. Faustus, das ersehnte, aber für einen Studenten unerschwingliche Werk von Thomas Mann, ist nur eine Leihgabe aus der Bücherei des Studentenwerkes. Lehrbücher müssen durch vervielfältigte Manuskripte ersetzt werden, denn zahllose Bibliotheken sind verbrannt und auch neue Lehrbücher sind für eine Studentenbörse meist zu teuer. Aber man hilft sich auch so. Bill staunt täglich über das bescheidene Essen. Man muss sich mit dem Billigsten bescheiden. Nur einmal in der Woche reicht der Verdienst zu einem Fleischgericht. Doch viele andere wissen nichts davon. Auf jede Art und Weise versuchen sie, zu etwas Geld zu kommen. Dieser hier zum Beispiel verkauft Zeitungen. Auch für Studierende ist Geld der Motor des Lebens. Bill ist mit seinen Kameraden nach Deutschland gekommen, um alles zu sehen und alles kennenzulernen. Geschwister-Scholl-Platz, der Platz vor der Münchner Universität. Ein Denkmal für den mutigen und freiheitsliebenden Geist zweier junger Studenten. Ihren Widerstand gegen den Geist der Tyrannei und Gewalt mussten sie mit ihrem Leben bezahlen. Hier, von der Galerie des Lichthofes der Universität, warfen sie ihre Flugblätter gegen den Nationalsozialismus unter die Menge der Studenten. Die missbrauchte Stätte der Wissenschaft und Humanität ging in Flammen auf. Nichts hinterließ der Geist der Gewalt als Trümmer, Schutt und Elend. Die Hörsäle sind zerstört. 4 Jahre lasteten die Folgen dieses Krieges auf der Wirtschaft. Nur Schritt für Schritt ging es hier und dort ein wenig vorwärts. Doch überall wird aufgeräumt und aufgebaut. Bill sieht, mit welcher Energie und mit welchem Fleiß man wieder arbeitet. Der Rhythmus eines neuen Lebens hallt durch die alte Stadt. Täglich steht eine Schlange von Studierenden vor den Selbsthilfeeinrichtungen des Studentenwerkes. Der Studentenschnelldienst vermittelt Arbeitskräfte für jede Beschäftigung. 90 Pfennig die Stunde. Für manchen ein Vermögen, das bis zum nächsten Tag weiterhilft. 8 Stunden Arbeit neben schwerem Studium sind keine Seltenheit. Ob Tag, ob Nacht, auch der schwerste Auftrag wird ausgeführt. Man darf sich nichts entgehen lassen. Unmittelbar nach der Währungsreform wurde diese Arbeitsvermittlung für Studenten geschaffen. Eine Idee wurde dadurch für zahllose Studierende zum Retter der Existenz und des Studiums. Doch für Bill ist das alles ungewöhnlich. Die Beschäftigungskurve ging steil in die Höhe. Man versorgt Babys, betätigt sich als Gepäckträger oder bewacht sogar Autos. Hilf fix, das Mädchen für alles, ist heute das Ei des Kolumbus für mittellose Studenten. Täglicher Andrang auch im Gesundheitsdienst. Die Quittung des Krieges kommt hier zusammen. Körperbeschädigt, krank, heimatlos, besitzlos. Man hilft, wo man helfen kann. Die knappen Gelder richtig zu verwenden, ist hier ein tägliches Problem. Für Bill und Jerry ein Blick in die tiefste Not. Sie fragen und diskutieren. Von Mensch zu Mensch ist alles viel verständlicher. Und wenn man auch nicht helfen kann, so bleibt doch das Erlebnis und die Freundschaft. So geht es Tag für Tag. Oft kann man weiter nichts als registrieren. Ein Student und seine Habe ziehen um. Die Wohnverhältnisse sind katastrophal. Studentenfamilien sind heute keine Seltenheit mehr. und mancher friert. Mit hängendem Magen und blauen Fingern geht es ins nächste Examen. Scheinbar unlösbare Probleme. Doch die Kameradschaft über die Grenzen der Länder und Sprache hinweg führt zu neuen Gedanken. Zerstörung ringsherum ist ein warnendes Zeichen für die Zukunft. Mit dem Geist vorwärts planend soll man das Geschehene und die Fehler und ihre Ursachen niemals vergessen. Der Mensch, der erst zerstörte, baut wieder auf. Wird es ein Fundament für neue Zeiten werden? Diese Frage ist die Entscheidungsfrage der Jugend. Die Technik und die Wissenschaft zum Aufbau der Welt zu benutzen, ist die Verpflichtung der geistigen Jugend aller Nationen. Der Geist der Zerstörung und Gewalt wird immer wieder versuchen, von Neuem aufzustehen. Wie dürfte also der Geist der Humanität und des Fortschritts kapitulieren? Die Wissenschaft hat unser ganzes Weltbild verwandelt. Ungeahnte Naturkräfte liegen gebändigt in der Hand der Menschen. Ob zum Guten oder zum Bösen, das liegt allein an uns. Nur der Mensch formt diese Welt und unsere Zukunft. Die Technik ohne sittliches Fundament kann uns zu Tode stürzen. Es gibt kein Halt für den menschlichen Geist, es sei denn durch sein eigenes Verbrechen. Unser Schicksal und unsere Zukunft sind nur durch Erziehung zu lösen. Menschlichkeit und Nächstenliebe müssen den weiteren Lauf der Welt bestimmen. Die Jugend der ganzen Erde muss eine neue Welt errichten. Lerne die Menschen anderer Nationen achten und verstehen. Das ist die Voraussetzung für den Frieden unter den Völkern. Und darum ist dieser Versuch zur Völkerverständigung zwischen der studentischen Jugend Deutschlands und der USA
ein hoffnungsvolles Experiment.